Under the slow-setting sun of rural West Carolina, where the roads cracked under summer heat and old mailboxes leaned toward silence, Ryan Hunter was welding the final joint on his new steel gate. It was the kind of gate people didn't forget. Nearly 8 feet high, mounted into thick concrete pillars, hand-forged from dark weather-treated iron with inward-pointing spikes that gave it the quiet dignity of permanence. Not the type you hang for style. This one had weight, history, and intent. The kind of gate you build when you're done asking people to respect your property. Ryan wiped the sweat from his temple with a gloved hand, his gaze sweeping the edge of his gravel driveway that met the public road. It wasn't just a fence. It was a line drawn after too many ignored conversations, too many passive-aggressive notes about lawn consistency, and too many cars using his long drive as a shortcut toward the lake. It was also his answer to Carolyn Stevens. Carolyn Stevens had a voice like lemon squeezed into an open wound and the posture of someone who'd never been told no in her entire adult life. She was, unofficially, the president of the neighborhood's property council, a group that had no legal authority over Ryan's parcel, but plenty of opinions and inherited clout. She didn't like his tool shed. She didn't like that he stored firewood in piles visible from the road. She didn't like his truck, and, most of all, she didn't like his silence. Ryan wasn't loud, he wasn't combative, but he also wasn't cooperative in the way Carolyn expected men like him to be. She'd knocked on his door once, a year back, with a laminated printout of neighborhood standards and a sugar-sweet offer to help get him aligned. He'd simply closed the door. Since then, the air between their properties had thickened, a kind of low-frequency tension vibrating in every interaction. His land sat on the outskirts of the neighborhood association's influence, a gray zone from a zoning mistake 20 years prior. That meant he wasn't under their bylaws, wasn't paying fees, and wasn't part of their meetings. Still, Carolyn insisted their shared values should extend to everyone on the street, especially now, with new developers eyeing the area and Carolyn desperately wanting to keep everything looking unified for their brochures. She'd tried charm. Then she'd tried pressure. Now, apparently, she'd moved on to war. Ryan hadn't come here for war. He'd come to get away from people like Carolyn. After the collapse of his old family home upstate and years working a trade that had chewed his knees to bone, he'd found the plot by accident. A foreclosure with crumbling fencing, an abandoned barn, and a house sagging with age. But it had land. Trees, distance. It gave him what the world had refused him in his younger years. Peace on his own terms. He poured every spare dollar into restoring it. Learned welding in his mid-40s to fix the barn's support frame. Rewired the main house with the help of one quiet electrician who didn't ask questions. Slowly, the house and land returned to form, not polished or staged, but lived in and fortified. The final straw came when 2 kids from the neighborhood tore through his land on motorbikes, carving up the soil near his blueberry rows and knocking down a cedar sapling he'd planted for his mother's birthday. Their parents never came by to apologize. When Ryan addressed it at the community center, Carolyn took the microphone, smiled her public smile, and talked about learning moments and boys being boys. That was when he decided, no more half measures. He marked his lines, calculated setbacks, got a certified survey, and began construction on the gate and full perimeter fencing. When the cement trucks came, Carolyn sent a letter reminding him that the community preferred open aesthetics. He didn't open it. When her cousin Greg, a local contractor, drove by slowly 3 times in one day, he simply waved from the porch without moving. They took the hint. But even silence has its weight. Word traveled. People stopped waving as they drove past. A few stopped altogether, just long enough to stare. One man even pulled into the driveway under the pretense of being lost, then asked where Ryan had gotten the idea for a fortress. The mail began arriving later. The trash collection skipped 2 weeks in a row. When Ryan called the waste company, the woman on the phone paused and then said she'd have to check with her supervisor before resuming pickup. The chill didn't come in loud knocks. It came in procedural whispers, the small-town way of letting you know you weren't liked. Ryan, of course, wasn't new to being disliked. You don't spend years in restoration work dealing with clients who think antique means free labor without learning how to handle egos. What he wasn't used to, though, was the sheer pettiness of suburbia. He wasn't a fighter by default, but he had no interest in being swallowed. And that's what this was. Not neighborly suggestion, not concern. It was control disguised as cohesion. So the gate went up, cemented, bolted, aligned to the millimeter. The lock was reinforced steel. The keypad required a passphrase. There were no cameras. Ryan didn't trust electronics the same way he didn't trust short friendships or fancy warranties. If something broke, he wanted to fix it with his own hands. That night, as the stars bled into the sky and the cicadas screamed their twilight warnings, Ryan sat on the porch with his boots off, the bitter sting of metal filings still lingering in his nostrils. The gate was done. He could feel it behind him like a sentinel. Carolyn would no doubt react. He didn't know how, but he knew enough about people like her to sense the storm forming behind the smile. The property council wasn't built for negotiation. It was built to outlast through wear. But Ryan wasn't planning to give them the luxury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pick fights. But when it came to defending what he'd earned, Ryan Hunter didn't back off. Not then. Not now. And especially not for someone like Carolyn Stevens. The first sign that something had shifted came 2 mornings later when Ryan found a man he didn't recognize standing just outside his gate, clipboard in hand, sunglasses shading a face lined with the kind of self-importance usually reserved for low-level bureaucrats. He didn't wear a uniform, didn't drive a marked vehicle, just a dusty sedan idling a few feet from the ditch. When Ryan stepped outside, the man didn't smile or wave. He simply held up the clipboard like a priest offering a relic. Ryan walked down the path slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans, already sensing that whatever this was, it would not be good. "You're Mr. Hunter?" the man asked, voice flat, official. Ryan nodded, but didn't extend a hand. Years of instinct taught him that some people came with friendliness and others with paperwork meant to grind you down. The man cleared his throat and glanced briefly over his shoulder at the gate, his face twisting in something close to disapproval. "You've been cited for unauthorized obstruction of a community easement." He spoke the words mechanically as if reciting a spell he didn't fully believe in but knew better than to question. Ryan didn't answer immediately. He took the clipboard, flipped through the stapled forms. It was a formal complaint signed by several neighbors, names he recognized only vaguely, alleging that the newly installed gate restricted access to a shared rural pathway essential for community maintenance and safety. The language was careful, dry, the kind that looked harmless until it crushed you with court costs and paperwork fees. The accusation was nonsense, of course. His gate didn't block any recognized pathway. The road past his driveway belonged to the county, and his driveway was legally private. He had the deeds, the surveys, the approvals, all properly filed and notarized. But the problem wasn't legality. It was the slow bleed of attrition. They weren't trying to beat him in court. They were trying to bury him in processes, fees, and obligations until the fight itself wasn't worth it. He handed the clipboard back without signing anything, locking eyes with the man long enough to make his point. The man didn't argue. He simply left a yellow notice zip-tied to the outer fence post, official-looking, cheap paper curling at the edges in the rising heat, and drove off without another word. Ryan stood there for a long moment, staring at the sign as the dust from the sedan's tires hung in the morning air like smoke. Later that afternoon, while working inside his shed, Ryan caught the faint sound of tires crunching over gravel. He stepped into the doorway just in time to see a group of people gathering at the end of his driveway. 6, maybe 7, all dressed casually but carrying the unmistakable air of a planned confrontation. Carolyn Stevens, larger than life in a bright pink blouse and too tight khakis, led the small crowd. In her hand, she held a heavy folder stuffed with documents. At her side stood Greg, her cousin, the contractor who once offered to help Ryan with his property issues for a fee. A few others hung back, arms crossed or hands jammed in pockets, watching but not speaking. Carolyn called out brightly, voice carrying across the distance as if they were old friends meeting by chance. "Ryan, we need to have a quick chat, neighbor to neighbor." Ryan didn't move. He didn't invite them onto his land. He simply stood in the shed's shadow, wiping grease from a wrench with slow, deliberate strokes. After a few seconds of awkward silence, Carolyn pressed forward, her tone turning just a shade sharper. "We have some concerns about your barrier. It's creating confusion, and honestly, it's dangerous for emergency services. Imagine if a fire broke out." Ryan said nothing. He knew this tactic too well. Frame the problem as public safety. Create a false urgency. Make resistance seem selfish, even reckless. When the silence stretched too long, Carolyn's smile twitched. She lifted the folder, flipping it open with a flourish. "You see, according to the neighborhood planning guidelines," she began, but Ryan cut her off with a slight shake of his head. "I'm not under your guidelines," he said simply, voice steady. Carolyn's nostrils flared slightly. Greg muttered something under his breath that Ryan didn't catch. Another man, one Ryan recognized vaguely as living 2 streets down, shifted his weight and looked away. Carolyn tried again, sweetness forced back into her voice like air into a punctured tire. "Ryan, nobody wants to make this a bigger deal than it is, but if you don't comply, we'll have to escalate things. Legal channels, citations, maybe even a formal injunction. You really don't want that kind of headache. Just remove the gate, and we can all move forward." Ryan studied them for a long moment, then wiped his hands clean, tossed the rag onto a nearby workbench, and walked slowly toward the house without another word. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice. He simply left them standing there, the message unmistakable. The group lingered for a few minutes longer, murmuring among themselves, but eventually dispersed. Greg threw a dark glance over his shoulder before climbing into his truck. Carolyn was the last to leave, her wide frame silhouetted against the sinking sun as she stared at the gate like it was a personal affront to her authority. Ryan watched from a window, the weight in his chest heavier than anger. This wasn't over. They wouldn't stop just because he ignored them. He understood that now. They would keep coming, keep wearing him down, layer after layer, until something cracked. He needed to prepare. The next morning, Ryan drove into town, not to a hardware store or a sheriff's office, but to the county clerk. He spent 3 hours going over property maps, easement rights, and historical surveys. He made copies, notarized affidavits where necessary, and filed a statement of private access rights against his driveway, creating an additional layer of legal protection. When he left the building, the late afternoon heat was oppressive, and his shirt clung to his back with the effort of navigating bureaucracy, but he felt steadier. That night he reinforced the gate's hinges, installed tamper-proof bolts, and placed heavy steel wedges into the ground at strategic points. It wasn't just about keeping them out physically, it was about making every attempt costly and visible. No quiet sabotages. No plausible deniability. If they wanted to tear his gate down, they would have to do it in full view of everyone. And sure enough, 2 nights later, someone tried. Ryan was lying in bed, the window cracked open to let in the humid breeze, when he heard it. A clattering metallic sound. Faint but distinct. Not the casual shuffle of raccoons or the shriek of a bird, but a deliberate, human sound. He moved quietly, slipping into his jeans and boots, grabbing the heavy flashlight from his bedside. No guns, no drama, just light and presence. He stepped onto the porch and shone the beam down the driveway. In the circle of light, a figure bolted from the gate, sprinting clumsily toward a waiting car idling without headlights on the road. The car peeled away in a spray of gravel before Ryan could make out the plates. When he inspected the gate, he found scratches near the lock, fresh scrapes on the iron surface, and a discarded crowbar half buried in the dirt. He collected it carefully, wrapping it in a clean rag, and placed it inside his shed. The next day, he filed a second report with the sheriff. This time, the deputy who came out took it more seriously. They'd had complaints about rising vandalism in the area, he said, particularly targeting properties out of compliance with community aesthetics. Ryan didn't bother asking who was filing those complaints. He already knew. The deputy recommended motion lights and perhaps even surveillance cameras. Ryan nodded, but said nothing. Cameras were easy to disable, easy to tamper with. He preferred deterrence that didn't blink. Later that week, another letter arrived. This one was more formal, printed on heavy paper with a letterhead from a small legal office 2 towns over. It demanded immediate cessation of obstruction and removal of the gate within 15 business days or face a civil lawsuit for damages and interference with community access rights. The language was sterner now, colder, stripped of neighborly pretense. Ryan sat at the kitchen table with the letter before him, sipping black coffee as dusk settled over the land. The fan rattled in the window. The gate stood firm outside, its shadow stretching long across the gravel. He didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He simply folded the letter, placed it into a manila folder already fat with documents, and added another line to his growing ledger of their attempts. He wasn't playing defense anymore. He was waiting. The heavy clouds rolled low and gray across the sky that Saturday morning, a warning that the weather, like everything else around Ryan Hunter lately, was turning volatile. He had woken before dawn, as he usually did, slipping into the slow rhythm of coffee, careful inventory of his tools, and the quiet pacing along the inside edge of the fence. Habit and instinct both guided him now. He had learned over the past weeks to trust the tightening coil of caution in his gut more than any neighborly smile or hollow apology. By the time the first car slowed outside his driveway, he already had a wrench tucked casually into the back pocket of his jeans and his boots laced tight. It was Greg again, Carolyn's contractor cousin, driving a mud-smeared work truck that looked deliberately chosen to project indifference. He didn't honk, didn't call out, just parked half a foot too close to the gate, door swinging open with a creak loud enough to carry down the gravel stretch to where Ryan stood. Greg climbed out slowly, a smirk half hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, and leaned against the truck's battered hood with the lazy air of a man spoiling for a fight he was confident he would win. Ryan stayed where he was, arms crossed loosely, one foot braced against the bottom step of the porch. He had no intention of giving Greg the satisfaction of meeting him at the gate like a dog summoned by a whistle. Greg spat to the side, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and finally spoke. "Just letting you know, buddy, some of us been talking. You're making things harder than they gotta be." His voice was casual but carried the unmistakable edge of threat. "Ain't right, locking out the folks that pay to keep these roads clear. Might be people start getting fed up." Ryan said nothing, studying the man's posture, the twitchy tension under the surface. Greg wasn't here for conversation. He was here to provoke a reaction, maybe even an excuse. Ryan refused to hand it to him. After a few moments of silence, Greg straightened, pulled a folded paper from his back pocket, and tossed it in an exaggerated arc toward the fence. It fluttered down, catching on the bottom rail where it sagged in the breeze. Without waiting for acknowledgement, Greg climbed back into his truck and gunned the engine, tires spitting loose gravel in Ryan's direction as he tore away down the road. When the dust settled, Ryan retrieved the paper without hurry. It was a notice, poorly formatted, half-legal at best, claiming that the neighborhood council had voted to authorize corrective action against any structures deemed to obstruct community access. No signatures, no county seal, just the vague implication that someone, somewhere, thought they had the right to undo what Ryan had built. He folded it once, cleanly, and dropped it into the burn barrel behind the shed without a second glance. But Greg's visit wasn't an empty bluff. Over the next 2 days, Ryan noticed small changes along the road leading to his property. Surveyor's flags appeared along the ditches, neon pink and orange marking nothing he could see but suggesting some impending work. An orange construction cone was dropped near the edge of his driveway. A slow-moving utility truck idled on the shoulder for the better part of an afternoon with 2 men inside pretending to check maps they never consulted. The message was clear. They were probing, looking for a weakness, a technicality they could exploit. Ryan responded the only way he knew how. He documented everything, each flag photographed, each vehicle logged with timestamps, each interaction, however minor, noted meticulously in a battered black notebook he kept tucked beside his coffee pot. If they wanted a battle of attrition, he would not meet them with fists and shouting matches like they hoped. He would meet them with patience sharpened into a weapon. It was late Tuesday night after a long day reinforcing the back fence line when the real escalation came. Ryan was dozing lightly on the worn leather couch in the front room, a book splayed face down on his chest, when the unmistakable sound of metal grinding against metal snapped him fully awake. He was on his feet before his mind even caught up, grabbing the flashlight and wrench by the door, heart pounding not with fear but with a cold, steady focus. Outside, under the weak beam of the flashlight, he saw them. 3 figures working at the gate, huddled close together in whispered urgency. One man wielded a cordless angle grinder, sparks hissing into the night air as he tried to cut through the reinforced lock. Another man stood watch, shifting from foot to foot like a caged animal, glancing nervously toward the road. The third figure, a woman, unmistakably Carolyn even under the poor lighting, held a heavy bolt cutter at her side, her broad frame tense and brimming with rage. Ryan did not yell. He did not call attention to himself. Instead, he stepped silently back inside, locked the front door, and picked up the cordless house phone he kept specifically for emergencies. The sheriff's private line, given to him after the last incident, was still stuck to the fridge with a magnet. He dialed it, voice calm and low as he reported the trespass in progress. "Stay inside. We're sending units," the deputy assured him, and Ryan obeyed, pulling the heavy blackout curtains closed and cutting the interior lights. He watched from a narrow gap between the fabric as the intruders worked, growing more frantic as the grinder whined against the stubborn lock. Then, without warning, it stopped. Carolyn barked something sharp, inaudible over the distance, and the man with the grinder hurled it to the ground with a clatter. The lookout spotted the faint flash of approaching headlights before any siren split the air, shouting in panic. They bolted, one stumbling, one dropping the bolt cutters entirely, but not before Ryan's cameras, primitive though they were, captured enough grainy footage to recognize every face. The responding deputies arrived within minutes, lights flooding the driveway with harsh clarity. Ryan stepped outside only when beckoned, speaking plainly, providing his documentation and offering the security footage without embellishment. He wasn't interested in dramatizing the event. The facts were bad enough. While the deputies inspected the gate and collected evidence, Ryan overheard snippets of radio chatter. The culprit's vehicle had been spotted fleeing toward town. An arrest wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. Property damage, attempted unlawful entry, violation of prior warnings, the charges stacked up neatly, clinical and unarguable. After the officers left, Ryan sat on the porch with his second cup of black coffee that night, the adrenaline draining from his muscles until he felt hollow and heavy. His land was silent again, but not peaceful. The air carried a different weight now, thicker, charged with something darker than petty spite. He knew Carolyn would not see this as defeat. People like her, when cornered, did not retreat with grace. They doubled down. They escalated. And next time, they would not come at night with tools and whispering accomplices. They would come brazenly, believing they had numbers, believing they had righteous cause. Ryan tipped the coffee mug toward the stars overhead, a bitter toast to the coming storm. He wasn't done building yet. He was just getting started. By the end of the week, the uneasy silence that had settled over the neighborhood cracked like old paint under pressure. Ryan knew better than to trust the quiet. It was the kind that meant trouble had simply changed shape, not disappeared. Sure enough, it was late Friday afternoon when the next blow fell. Not through vandalism or midnight sabotage this time, but through the front door in the form of an official-looking envelope delivered by certified mail. Ryan stood on his porch for a long moment after signing for it, turning the envelope over in his hands, feeling the weight of what was coming before he even broke the seal. Inside was a formal summons. Carolyn Stevens, representing a coalition of concerned residents, had filed a civil lawsuit against him for obstruction of community resources, emotional distress, and endangerment of public access routes. It was an absurd document, bloated with fabricated grievances and laughable accusations, but it wasn't the contents that set Ryan's jaw tight. It was the scale. This wasn't another underhanded prank or casual harassment. This was a coordinated, expensive move designed not to win but to exhaust him financially and mentally. It was a war of paperwork, fought by people who had the time, the money, and the petty vindictiveness to drag it out for years if necessary. Ryan spent that evening in a haze of quiet anger, sorting through the lawsuit page by page at his kitchen table. He didn't bother cursing or breaking anything. Anger was a luxury he could not afford. Instead, he made a list. First item: call the attorney he'd quietly consulted weeks ago, the one he hoped he wouldn't need. Second, begin assembling every piece of evidence he had, from property deeds to photographs to witness statements. Third, prepare for a long fight without the naive hope that the truth alone would be enough. He was in town early the next morning, sitting across a battered oak desk from Gerald McKinney, a sharp-eyed lawyer with a limp and a reputation for taking cases others considered lost causes. Gerald leafed through the paperwork Ryan handed him, his frown deepening with every page. When he finally looked up, there was no false reassurance in his gaze. "They're throwing everything at you but the kitchen sink," Gerald said, tapping the edge of the summons with a thick finger. "Half of this won't stand up in court, but that's not the point. They want to drain you. Time, money, patience, until you settle, just to get them off your back." Ryan nodded grimly. "What's our move?" Gerald leaned back, considering. First, countersue. Frivolous litigation. Harassment. Abuse of process. Then file a motion to dismiss based on jurisdiction. If we can show the council has no authority over your property, and I think we can knock this down before it even gets to discovery. Ryan felt a small ember of satisfaction stir in his chest. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a step. "And the council?" Ryan asked, voice low. Gerald smiled thinly. "The council's made up of people, Ryan. People who don't want their personal finances dragged into public court records. If we push back hard enough, they'll scatter." By the time Ryan left Gerald's office, the storm clouds were gathering in earnest over town, both literal and metaphorical. The wind picked up, whipping dust down the narrow streets, and the first fat drops of rain splattered against his windshield as he drove home. It seemed fitting. Conflict didn't come in clean, dry packages. It came heavy, messy, and cold. The next few days blurred into a grim procession of legal filings, notarized affidavits, and sworn statements. Ryan rarely left the property except to meet with Gerald or deliver paperwork to the courthouse. He ate when he remembered to, slept in snatches, and poured his remaining energy into shoring up the physical boundaries of his land even further. New locks, reinforced fencing along the back lot line, fresh gravel laid down to eliminate mud tracks that might later be twisted into evidence of disrepair. Through it all, the neighborhood seemed to hold its collective breath. No more direct confrontations. No more nighttime sabotage. Just a tension so thick it seemed to hum in the very air. A sense that something larger and uglier was coiling itself just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came the following Thursday, when Ryan returned from a brief supply run to find a notice pinned to his fence with a heavy roofing nail. It wasn't from Carolyn. It was from the county itself, a notice of a scheduled inspection of his property due to multiple community complaints regarding unsafe structures and potential code violations. It was a masterstroke of petty bureaucracy. Even if the inspection found nothing, the process alone could tie up his property in red tape for months. Permits, hearings, administrative reviews. All of it designed to bleed him dry without a single direct confrontation. Ryan read the notice twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the front pocket of his flannel shirt. He didn't panic. He didn't lash out. Instead, he drove back into town, calm and methodical, and walked into the office of the county inspector listed on the form. A woman in her late 50s sat behind the cluttered desk, glasses perched low on her nose, the smell of stale coffee thick in the air. Ryan introduced himself, laid the notice on her desk, and asked, politely, firmly, to see the specific complaints filed against him. The woman sighed, rifled through a stack of folders, and eventually produced a thin file labeled with his name. Inside were photocopies of handwritten notes, most vague to the point of comedy. Fence might be dangerous. Gate too high for neighborhood aesthetic. Possible illegal grading work. Ryan pointed out calmly and without raising his voice that none of the accusations had any attached evidence, photographs, or reports from licensed surveyors. Just unsigned complaints from concerned residents. The woman adjusted her glasses, studied him for a long moment, and finally said, "Off the record, Mr. Hunter, you're getting railroaded. But if you don't let us do the inspection, they'll use that against you too." Ryan nodded. He wasn't angry at her. She was trapped by the same system, just on a different rung of the ladder. They scheduled the inspection for the following week. Ryan spent the intervening days documenting every inch of his property, photographing, measuring, cross-referencing with building codes and county guidelines. He was ready. When the day of the inspection arrived, Ryan met the two county officers at the gate with a clipboard, a polite nod, and a prepared list of each structure on his property, along with its corresponding permits and compliance certificates. He didn't obstruct them. He didn't antagonize. He simply stayed close, answered questions when asked, and made damn sure they saw the pristine condition of every nail, board, and bolt. After 2 grueling hours, the lead inspector, a gruff man with sunburned skin and a perpetually skeptical expression, closed his notebook with a grunt. "No violations found," he said shortly. "You'll get a letter." Ryan nodded once, watching as the men climbed back into their county-issued truck and disappeared down the dusty road. Another battle won. Another inch of ground defended. But he knew better than to celebrate. The war wasn't over. Not even close. Carolyn wasn't finished. The council wasn't finished. They would regroup, reframe the fight, come at him from some new angle. As the sun sank low behind the tree line, staining the horizon blood red, Ryan stood at the top of his porch steps and surveyed his land. The fences, the gate, the fields stretching beyond into the dusk. They would come again, and when they did, he would be ready. The calm that followed the failed inspection was deceptive. The way the woods go quiet before a predator strikes. Ryan knew better than to assume the storm had passed. He had dealt with enough people like Carolyn Stevens to understand that setbacks only made them meaner, not wiser. He continued with his routine, maintaining the property, keeping records of every interaction, and watching the road from his porch without making it obvious. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Carolyn had already shown she was willing to twist legal channels against him. It was only a matter of time before she tried something dirtier. The first hint came late one evening, after Ryan returned from a trip into town for supplies. As he approached the gate, his headlights caught a glint of something metallic scattered across the gravel entrance. He stopped the truck 20 feet back, killing the engine and stepping out carefully, flashlight in hand. A scattering of roofing nails, hundreds of them, had been dumped across the driveway just inside the property line. It wasn't random either. The pattern was deliberate, covering the entire width of the entrance where tires would be forced to roll. Ryan took a slow breath, knelt, and began collecting them by hand, working under the weak beam of his flashlight. It took over an hour to clear the worst of it. His fingers were raw by the time he finished, dirt and steel dust ground into the cracks of his skin. He didn't call the sheriff this time. It would leave no clear fingerprints, and it would be dismissed as mischief by the time paperwork filtered through the system. No, this wasn't a case for law enforcement. This was a message, plain and simple. You're not welcome. You're not safe. Give up. Ryan didn't give up. He spent the next morning welding thin steel grates beneath the gravel in front of the gate, invisible to casual eyes but strong enough to shred anything larger than a roofing nail should they try again. It was ugly, low-tech, and effective, exactly the kind of countermeasure that suited him. Days passed without further incidents, but the tension tightened like a noose. Every dog bark at night snapped his head toward the window. Every slow-moving car on the county road earned his full attention. Then, one sticky evening just after sunset, it escalated. Ryan was sitting on his porch, sipping black coffee despite the heat, when the sound of a loudspeaker broke the heavy dusk air. At first, he thought it was coming from a car stereo, distorted by distance. But then the words became clear, blaring across the fields like a taunt. Community standards must be upheld. Non-compliance will not be tolerated. Over and over again, the same phrase delivered in a tinny, aggressive loop. Ryan stood slowly, heart hammering not from fear, but from disbelief. Down at the road, a large white pickup truck crept along the fence line. Mounted on the roof was a makeshift PA system, and in the driver's seat, unmistakable even at this distance, sat Carolyn Stevens, her wide frame barely contained by the steering wheel. Beside her, Greg leaned out the passenger window, whooping and laughing as they broadcast their petty terror campaign into the night. Ryan didn't rise to the bait. He didn't shout. He didn't run down the driveway waving his fists. Instead, he turned on the floodlights he had installed along the perimeter, bright, blinding beams that sliced through the night and illuminated the truck like a stage show. Carolyn flinched visibly. Greg cursed and ducked back inside. A few moments later, the truck gunned its engine and sped away, the loudspeaker still squawking until the signal finally faded into the distance. Ryan documented the entire incident, filing a fresh complaint with the sheriff's department the next morning, attaching security footage from the floodlight's motion-activated cameras. It wasn't much, disturbing the peace, maybe harassment, but it added weight to the growing mountain of evidence. Every small infraction, every act of intimidation built a pattern, and patterns were hard to ignore once presented under oath. Gerald McKinney, his attorney, was pleased. "Let them keep digging their own graves," he said dryly when Ryan showed him the footage. But Carolyn wasn't just relying on theatrics. A few days later, Ryan received notice that a new petition had been filed with the county planning board, a proposal to declare the entire stretch of land encompassing his property and several adjacent parcels as a community beautification zone, subject to strict aesthetic and access guidelines. If approved, it would allow the council to impose regulations retroactively, regulations that would force Ryan to remove his gate, alter his fencing, and comply with their absurd vision of uniformity. It was a brutal play, one that took money, connections, and a sheer bloody-minded willingness to steamroll dissent. And if the planning board approved it, Ryan's defenses would be crushed under bureaucratic weight rather than by force. He attended the first hearing at the courthouse out of grim obligation, dressed in his cleanest shirt and boots, standing quietly in the back of the room while Carolyn and her allies presented their case with oily smiles and sanctimonious speeches about community values and protecting property investment. When it came time for a public comment, Ryan stepped to the microphone. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply read into the record the deeds, the legal surveys, the notarized statements from former property owners, establishing beyond any doubt that his land had never, under any version of county planning, been considered part of the shared community developments. He cited case law. He cited ordinances. He cited common sense. The room was silent when he finished, a heavy, uncomfortable silence that said more than any applause could have. The planning board chairman, a tired man with deep lines carved into his face by decades of petty disputes like this one, cleared his throat and announced that a decision would be deferred pending further review. Ryan knew what that meant. Delay. More paperwork. More chances for Carolyn to regroup and strike from another angle. He drove home under a sky churning with dark clouds, the humid air promising a storm that mirrored the one tightening around his land. That night, lightning forked across the horizon in brilliant, jagged flashes. Thunder rolled in waves so deep it rattled the windows. Ryan sat at the kitchen table, a stack of documents spread before him, and planned his next moves. He wasn't naive enough to believe he could win this by simply being right. He had to be relentless. Every form filed on time, every interaction documented, every threat countered with a measured, calculated response. It was exhausting work, not the life he had envisioned when he bought this land, but it was the only way to survive a siege dressed up as neighborly concern. The next escalation came not through letters or committees, but through crude, physical action. Early one morning, before the sun fully crested the hills, Ryan found his mailbox ripped from the ground, twisted and broken, flung into the ditch 50 feet away. It wasn't kids. The damage was too deliberate, too targeted. He replaced it that afternoon with a heavy-duty steel post sunk in concrete 4 feet deep, the kind used by rural farms to withstand winter plows. That same evening, a rock the size of a softball sailed through his front window while he was eating dinner. It landed heavily in the living room, scattering glass across the floorboards. Ryan didn't chase shadows into the night. He didn't wave a shotgun around or call the local news. He called the sheriff, documented the damage, and had the window boarded up before midnight. Each attack was another link in the chain, another data point building the picture of coordinated harassment. Gerald filed motions to include the new incidents in their countersuit, citing them as evidence of ongoing retaliation. The deeper Carolyn pushed, the more she revealed about herself, a petty tyrant who couldn't bear to lose, whose need for control outweighed any sense of shame or caution. Ryan understood her now, understood her weakness. She believed in appearances. She needed to win publicly, to humiliate him in front of the community, to prove that no one could stand against her authority. Ryan wasn't interested in appearances. He was interested in survival, in defense, in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that no matter how hard they pushed, he would not bend, would not break. The stage was set. The final act was coming, and this time it wouldn't be played out in whispered threats or shadowy vandalism. It would happen in the open, under the hard, unforgiving sun, where there would be no more lies left to tell. The morning it all came to a head was oppressively hot, even before the sun had climbed fully into the sky. The air clung to Ryan Hunter's skin as he worked in the side yard, repairing a hinge on the secondary gate, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knew he was being watched. He had noticed it earlier, the way cars slowed slightly as they passed, the way conversations in driveways seemed to pause when he appeared. He wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. No, Carolyn Stevens and her people had simply shifted tactics again, coiling tighter before the final strike. He finished tightening the hinge and stood for a moment, stretching the stiffness from his back when he heard it, the low, rumbling growl of a heavy engine coming up the road. It wasn't unusual for trucks to pass by, but something about the way this one didn't slow, didn't stop, set the hairs on his arms standing straight up. He moved toward the main gate, instincts screaming a warning he didn't yet have words for. From the crest of the road, he saw the big, black pickup barreling toward him, dust and gravel churning under its wheels. The truck wasn't slowing. If anything, it was accelerating. In the driver's seat, unmistakable even at a distance, was Carolyn herself, her wide frame hunched forward over the steering wheel, a look of determined madness etched onto her face. Her hands gripped the wheel like a drowning woman clutching a life raft, and in her eyes burned the desperate light of someone who had decided they would rather destroy everything than lose. Ryan didn't run. He didn't step aside. He simply braced himself as the truck hurtled closer, his mind already calculating angles and outcomes. At the last possible second, Carolyn cranked the wheels slightly, aiming the front bumper squarely at the locked gate. There was a moment of terrible silence, a breathless suspension of time, and then the impact came. The heavy steel gate shuddered under the force, but it didn't yield. The reinforced concrete posts groaned. The ground trembled, and the front end of Carolyn's truck crumpled with a metallic scream of protest. The airbags deployed instantly, a bloom of white obscuring her face as the truck's momentum carried it up and over the base of the gate. The wheels spun uselessly for a second before the frame bottomed out, leaving the vehicle grotesquely perched like a wounded animal. Ryan exhaled slowly, the tension bleeding from his body as he walked down the driveway with measured, deliberate steps. He could hear Carolyn shouting inside the cab, muffled and incoherent, thrashing against the deployed airbags. The sight might have been absurd if not for the violence behind it, the clear, unrepentant hatred that had driven her to this point. He didn't approach too closely. He didn't need to. He pulled out his phone, not to film, but to make the one call that mattered. The sheriff's private line. No theatrics, no social media posts, just the cold, hard machinery of law that Carolyn had so long thought she could manipulate. "She rammed the gate," Ryan said simply when the sheriff picked up. "She's stuck. You might want to bring a tow." The sheriff arrived within 15 minutes, sirens off, lights flashing in the heavy morning air. 2 deputies followed in a second cruiser. Ryan stood off to the side, arms crossed loosely over his chest, watching as they approached the truck. Carolyn was still inside, red-faced and screaming now, pounding her fists against the dashboard like a petulant child denied candy. When the deputies tried to open the door, she resisted, kicking at them wildly. It took both men to pull her free, struggling against her bulk as she shrieked about property rights and citizens' arrests and illegal structures. None of it made any sense, and none of it mattered. The sheriff, a tall man with silver at his temples and permanent lines of exhaustion around his eyes, simply watched her coldly until she burned herself out. "You're under arrest, Mrs. Stevens," he said when she finally sagged against the side of the truck, breathing heavily. "Reckless endangerment, destruction of private property, criminal trespass, driving under the influence of a controlled substance." Ryan's eyebrows lifted slightly at that last charge, but it made sense. No sober mind would have believed ramming a truck into a fortified gate was a viable plan. The deputies cuffed Carolyn's wrists behind her back, guiding her none too gently towards the cruiser. She twisted around once, managing to lock eyes with Ryan. Her face was a mask of rage and disbelief, as if she still couldn't fathom how she could lose. Ryan met her gaze evenly, offering no satisfaction, no gloating, just the steady, immovable presence that had frustrated her from the start. The sheriff crossed the distance to Ryan with slow, deliberate steps, scanning the damage as he came. He stopped a few feet away, hands on his hips, and let out a low whistle. She really thought she could knock that thing down. Ryan shrugged. Guess she thought she had the weight for it. The sheriff chuckled humorlessly. She'll be facing serious charges. This isn't a slap on the wrist anymore. Reckless endangerment alone could put her away for a while, and that's before we get into the DUI and property damage. He paused, considering. You want to press additional charges? Ryan thought about it for a moment. Thought about the months of harassment, the vandalism, the endless petty warfare. Thought about the nails, the rocks, the noise, the fear. Then he shook his head once, slowly. I'll let the law handle it, he said. I just want her gone. The sheriff nodded, respect flickering briefly across his weathered face. Fair enough. We'll impound the truck, too. Probably belongs to her husband's company. Doubt they'll be thrilled. Ryan stayed until the tow truck arrived, its diesel engine rumbling low as the driver winched the ruined vehicle off his gate. The damage to the gate itself was surprisingly minor. Scraped paint, a bent latch, but the concrete posts had held, just as he had designed them to. A small, grim satisfaction settled in his chest as he watched the wreck disappear down the road, Carolyn's muffled shouting fading into silence. By the time the dust settled, the neighborhood had started to wake up. A few curious faces peeked from behind curtains or ventured onto porches, pretending to check the mail or water flowers. No one approached. No one offered sympathy. They knew better. They knew they had let it happen, by their silence if nothing else. Ryan didn't need their apologies. He didn't need their approval. He turned back to the house, stepping carefully over the last bits of shattered plastic and rubber, and began sweeping the driveway clean. He worked steadily, methodically, the way he had approached every other challenge thrown at him. Not because he wanted to prove anything to them, but because the land deserved better than the mess Carolyn had left. It wasn't over, not completely. There would be court dates, insurance claims, more hearings. But the heart of the fight was broken now. The symbol of Carolyn's power had been dragged off on the back of a flatbed, and she wouldn't be coming back to reclaim it. Ryan had survived the siege, not through brute force, not through rage, but through the quiet, stubborn endurance that small towns forgot to teach anymore. As he locked the gate behind him that evening, the scars of the day barely visible against the battered steel, he allowed himself a rare smile. Not of triumph, but of relief. The property was still his. The peace he had fought for, guarded with sweat and patience and stubborn pride, had held. Tomorrow he would repaint the scratches, rehang the bent latch, patch the places where the ground had torn up under the tires, and then he would sit on the porch with his coffee and watch the road as he always had, steady and silent, daring anyone to try again. But deep down, Ryan knew they wouldn't. The message had been sent, loud and clear. Some lines, once drawn, are not crossed twice. The days that followed Carolyn Stevens' arrest slid into a strange, heavy calm, like the air after a hurricane when everything still stands, but nothing feels the same. Ryan Hunter moved through his routines with quiet efficiency, repairing the last scars left by her reckless attack, repainting the steel gate where her truck had gouged it, resetting the gravel where the tires had torn trenches into the earth. Each task felt almost ceremonial, a quiet reaffirmation that his land, battered but unbowed, still belonged to him. The sheriff's office stayed in regular contact, updating him as Carolyn's case moved slowly through the legal system. She had been formally charged with multiple offenses: reckless endangerment, destruction of private property, criminal trespass, driving under the influence. And it quickly became clear that her arrest had torn open a dam of long-simmering resentments among her supposed allies. More than one neighbor came forward with their own complaints, small but cumulative, painting a portrait of a woman who had spent years ruling through intimidation, favors, and whispered threats. Without Carolyn at the helm, the council that had once seemed so monolithic began to fracture. Greg, her cousin, distanced himself immediately, issuing public statements about how he had always advocated for peaceful resolution. Several other prominent members resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. The planning board shelved the proposal for the beautification zone indefinitely, unwilling to wade into what had become an ugly and very public mess. Ryan watched it unfold from a distance, uninterested and gloating, focused instead on the tangible, simple things that had always grounded him: maintaining the land, restoring the small damages, living by the steady rhythm he had fought so hard to protect. Some neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now offered cautious nods when they passed. A few even stopped by under the pretense of dropping off tools or spare parts, their conversations stilted and apologetic in ways they couldn't quite bring themselves to say outright. Ryan accepted the gestures without bitterness, but he didn't forget. Trust wasn't something he handed out because of a few uneasy smiles or murmured condolences. He had learned through months of attrition that survival wasn't about making peace with everyone. It was about knowing where to build walls and where to leave gates open, and he chose his boundaries carefully now. Gerald McKinney, his attorney, handled the final civil matters with ruthless precision. The countersuit for harassment, emotional distress, and malicious prosecution resulted in a settlement offer so swift it was almost laughable. Ryan didn't ask for an outrageous sum, just enough to cover his legal expenses, the repairs to his property, and a small additional amount as a symbolic acknowledgement of the hell they had put him through. Carolyn, facing mounting legal fees and the real possibility of a criminal conviction, accepted through her attorney without contest. The court signed off on a restraining order barring her from coming within 200 yards of his property or contacting him in any way. She wouldn't serve serious jail time. First offenses, even violent ones, often ended in probation and community service if the defendant had the right lawyer and no previous record. But her reputation was ruined. Her power, once rooted in fear and appearances, was shattered beyond repair. In a place like this, where memory was long and forgiveness short, that was a heavier sentence than any fine or jail term. Ryan didn't attend the final hearing. He didn't need to. Gerald called him afterward with a simple, satisfied update. "It's done," he said. "She's out of your life. Permanently." Ryan stood on the porch that evening, watching the sunset bleed gold and red across the horizon, a battered but unbroken sentinel. The land stretched out before him, quiet and alive, the trees whispering in the warm breeze, the fields rolling gently under the dying light. It was his. Still his. Not because he had shouted the loudest or struck the hardest, but because he had endured. He had stayed when others would have folded. He had fought on his terms, steadily, lawfully, with a patience that wore down even the most relentless assault. That was what survival meant. Not winning a single battle, but refusing to lose the war no matter how long it dragged on. Over time, life resumed its old rhythm. New families moved into the neighborhood, unaware or uninterested in the bitter conflict that had preceded them. The fields grew lush again, the fences stood firm, and the gate, battered but repaired, remained a quiet monument to everything Ryan had defended. Occasionally, old memories would stir, an unfamiliar car slowing near the driveway, a knock at the door after dark, but they never lingered. Ryan knew better now how to protect himself, how to listen to the land, to the small warnings in the shift of the air, the unsettled movements of the world just beyond his borders. There were scars, of course, invisible but deep, a slight tightening in his gut when legal envelopes arrived in the mail, a habit of checking locks twice before going to bed. But he bore them the way he bore all the other marks life had left on him, with quiet acceptance and a stubborn refusal to be defined by them. One evening, months after the final court date, a neighbor named James, a man who had largely kept his head down during the whole conflict, stopped by while walking his dog. He lingered awkwardly at the gate before finally speaking. "You know," James said, not quite meeting Ryan's gaze, "a lot of us, we're glad you didn't back down." Ryan considered that for a moment, the breeze tugging gently at his sleeves. He didn't smile, didn't offer reassurances or platitudes. He simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that said everything that needed saying. James nodded back, understanding, and continued on his way. The land returned to what it had always been meant to be, a place of peace, a sanctuary from the noise and smallness of the world beyond. And Ryan, standing watch over it as the stars bloomed overhead, knew with a certainty deeper than any contract or decree that he had earned every inch of it. Not by force, not by fame, but by patience, by resilience, and by the quiet, unbreakable conviction that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost.